Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I'm very grateful for this invitation. So thank you to all the colleagues and to the summer school and to the consortium for thinking of me in this context. My first visit to Lisbon, and it's really been an enormous pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for your hospitality as well. Okay, so the work that I'm going to present today is sort of taken from a book project that I'm working on right now, supposed to be finished next year, on the question of the migrant in Europe, which is, of course, a very broad question, and I'm sort of trying to raise some more concrete questions about the history of this question and what role it plays in the very constitution of ideas of Europeanness and European life and European experience. And I've been working on this project for some years now. In a kind of slow way, it's been on the back burner while I've been getting other things out at the same time. But now it's sort of become a much more sort of urgent project for me. Hopefully it's going to be published in 2019. Anyway, what I'm going to do right now is to present some sections that sort of lay out in very broad and somewhat abstract conceptual terms of how I'm thinking about this question, and rather than more concrete sort of elaborations and readings of texts and events and things of that sort. This is not a talk about literary translation per se, but when I was invited, I said that I'm not working on literary translation these days. In Forget English, of course, that question plays a role. And Professor Jill told me, no problem, you come and present whatever you want to. But of course, translation is a very important question here because I'm interested in migration and the figure of migrant, which is, of course, in many ways a figure of translation, many different ways, I think, as already we saw and discussed yesterday from the very first conversation with Hanif Qureshi onwards. Okay, so I'll just jump in. And by the way, nobody's ever told me how long this talk should be. So when my time is over, just let me know, and I'll stop. So, strangers in Europa, migrants, terrorists, refugees. What is the stranger's claim on me? When I encounter the other in the form of the stranger, what, if any, is my responsibility? And if indeed there is one, what is its nature exactly? Does it take a subjective or intersubjective form? Does it originate in the stranger's mere presence, or does it emerge in my approach to her? How does the encounter transform me, and how does it transform the stranger? Is it a reciprocal and symmetrical relationship that is to be established between us, or an irreducibly asymmetrical and one-sided one that is not dependent on my knowledge of the other's orientation or intention? The requirement of openness to the other, a core notion in Western ethical thinking, which according to Levinas even instantiates the basic ethical relationship, what concrete form does it take when the stranger enters my home, perhaps without having been invited? Levinas's concept metaphor for that which I actually engage in the encounter with an other, what he calls the face, is primarily a visual one. And the face-to-face encounter, as he calls it, brings the other into the realm of intelligibility. This is his word. That is, it invites and allows reading of the other's presence and reality, and openness to the possibility of a human encounter in the very midst of an encounter with the other. What I encounter in the face is, says Levinas, both the absolutely weak and absolutely exposed, but also at the same time, I quote, the thou shalt not kill, unquote. Not a commandment so much, he says, as a calling out to me, encouraging me to invest in the continued existence of the other. Levinas's description of the ethical encounter is a dramatic scenario in the aesthetic and etymological senses of the word, a scene in which meaningful and intelligible actions unfold according to some more or less implicit logic, but one that is more invitation than compulsion. Refugees are welcome here. This declaration, uttered typically in public spaces en masse, in English and with a German accent, became well known throughout the world during the summer and fall of 2015. It is, of course, an ethical statement, an invitation of sorts to strangers, and is deeply imbued with the history of Germany in the 20th century. It insists on performing a certain view of Germany as a society that takes responsibility for its history, or rather expresses the desire for this view of the country. It is, in other words, linked to and perhaps updates that curious and uniquely German activity of the post-war decades, coming to terms with the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Its intensity, sincerity, and insistent nature cannot be doubted, but what we must also note is its fragility, revealing as it does the possibly desperate hope that this invitation might take as an orientation in society as a whole, as a vaccine might take in a human body threatened by a deadly virus. The hope that Germany is not the country that outsiders can too easily accuse it of being by casually invoking its past. This German hope of inoculating society against its own lingering past with a welcome culture, Willkommenskultur, a tourist industry term that acquired this new ethical meaning in the course of the refugee crisis, is especially poignant in the face of the re-emergence of a dangerously successful right-wing political formation across the country. The emergence, I'm not trying to suggest a widespread, certainly not dominance or anything of that sort. Across the country, which is now even demonstrated its somewhat limited but nevertheless visible electoral viability. The political class in Germany, and in fact in Europe as a whole, has vacillated wildly between this view of society and its responsibility toward the stranger, and varieties of anxious, apologetic, defensive, or outright xenophobic and racist declarations about the threatened destruction of national and European values and culture by the influx of alien populations. Angela Merkel herself has traversed this polarity at least part of the way, emerging first as the leading spokesperson for the former view of society, but in the aftermath of the incidents of sexual violence on New Year's Eve in the streets of Cologne, New Year's Eve 2015, in the streets of Cologne, an event that was quickly and successfully stabilized in public discourse as an image of the future of that welcoming Germany, she veered suddenly toward the other end, calling for new legislation making it easier to deport failed asylum seekers and lawbreakers. And Merkel had, of course, become notorious the previous summer for having made a young Palestinian child cry on national television by her cold bureaucratic response to the girl's question about the fate of refugee families like hers. In the end, however, Merkel remains, as we all know, the most important of the small group of European leaders arguing for a common European policy of regularized admission of those seeking asylum, driven at least in part by the demographic needs of the German economy. As a prominent intellectual from Donald Rumsfeld's New Europe, if many of you are too young to remember this, during the Gulf War, the Iraq War, when Donald Rumsfeld, George Bush's defense secretary, in response to France's opposition to the war, dismissed, as he called it, old Europe, and spoke in favor of what he called New Europe, which is Eastern Europe, which the countries were just entering the European Union, and many of which, of course, supported the war efforts and even provided troops. As a prominent intellectual from Donald Rumsfeld's New Europe, that is, as a latecomer to the philosophical benefits and privileges of modern European identity, Slavoj Žižek has emerged as one of the leading champions on the left of the idea of European values and European civilization. In his conception of capitalism with European values, as he calls it, as a better alternative to the version with Asian values, but most clearly in his stance on the refugee crisis, Žižek has become a living object lesson concerning what Adorno famously identified as the latecomer's fierce attachment to the dominant cultural configuration. Those, I quote, "those whom repressive culture has held at a distance," Adorno argued, "can easily become its most die-hard defenders," unquote. An uncritical regard from which, I quote again, "socialism is in general no more secure than it is against lapsing theoretically into positivism, unquote. This is minimum moralia. While at a broader level, Zizek rightly seeks to link the problem of refugees to the economic and political imbalances of neoliberal capitalism itself, his examination of the problems generated by the mass migration of our times remains preoccupied with culture and values, and the price, as he puts it, that ought to be paid for, quote, European hospitality, unquote, by the refugees. The figure of post-colonial refugee is treated in Zizek's reflections above all as a figure of threat to the European way of life, who must be made to submit to European cultural norms. Like the liberal humanitarians whom he chastises, he himself seems incapable of viewing the colonial, post-colonial nature of this process of mass migration in anything other than a moralistic register, simply inverting the ideological fantasy that he attributes to the humanitarians. In Levinasian terms, we might say that the post-colonial refugee in Europe, a figure introduced to the whole world in 2015, but which actually has a much longer history in the continent, elements of which shall concern us here, seems to suffer from a certain indeterminacy in the European ethical imagination, appearing at one moment as the other, capable of existing in the face-to-face with the European ethical subject, and at another as executioner, to use Levinas's term, for he who, as he puts it, calls for violence and therefore no longer has a face, unquote. Starting with the attacks in Paris on January 7th, 2015, by two young native-born French men of North African Arab descent, and coming to an end in the violence in Cologne on December 31st by a crowd of non-white young men, as it's usually said, among them recent arrivals in the country, including, it is reported, Syrian asylum seekers. The year 2015 may thus be thought of as the year of the full emergence of Europe's migrant question. This popular ethical mode of comprehending the arrival of the stranger is perhaps not adequate to the reality it seeks to grasp, as it replicates the foundationalism of formal ethical thinking, including what, for instance, Georg Simmel already understood: the stranger marks a social relation, characterized by the strange coexistence, as he puts it, of familiarity and alienness, nearness and distance. And in part, what I'm trying to do in this project is to try and understand the forms of nearness and familiarity that the post-colonial migrant embodies in Europe today. Furthermore, while wanting to do away with what it sees as the foundationalism of ontology, the claim that the very philosophical thought of being heightens and alters our relationship to our being, the conceit that Adorno referred to as the jargon of authenticity, it cannot quite, formal ethical thinking of the Levinasian thought, it cannot quite let go of foundationalism as such. Where Levinasian ethics questions the vaunted priority of ontology, arguing instead that the ethical encounter, which it posits as the existential basis of all human life, is prior to all thought of being, today we must insist that the ethical itself needs to be refracted through the political, that is, through the social and historical. One of the great social and political questions of our times is whether the European project can survive its present crisis and threat of internal fragmentation. And really my argument is that this is not simply a question of concern to Europeans, but in very important ways a kind of universal question of our times. As we know, powerful forces seem to be arrayed against its survival, first of all within Europe itself, but now also including, it seems, the full weight of the current, of the new U.S. administration. There are in fact and the U.S. far right, and I've been talking to some of you in the last couple of days, that this research has also sort of taken me for the first time. I've never been very interested in American things, really, although I've lived there most of my adult life. But the rise of Trump has really sort of brought me into a kind of engagement with the far right in the U.S., which is much larger than we suspect it to be. And it's not the old far right of the KKK and all of that. It's a whole new generation, media-savvy young people, millennials. It's quite an extraordinary thing. And the question and the fate of Europe is very, very pertinent to them as well. They really talk about it and in those terms. And they're divided over the question of whether the European Union is a kind of globalist institution and therefore to be resisted, or whether it is at least a step towards the unification of the white European peoples into a kind of new Roman Empire, as it were. It's very interesting the way the American far right is talking about the European Union. Sorry. There are in fact two broad dimensions to the crisis, as I see it, usually spoken of independently of each other. The failure of economic and more precisely monetary integration on the one hand, and on the other, widespread breakdown of what we might think of as the multicultural system that has governed both intra and international social integration, with some national and regional variations in recent decades. In the course of this lecture, I attempt to chart some of the energies that flow in both directions between these two constellations. The figure of migrant in general, which can take under its purview second and even third generation native-born populations, is at the core of the multicultural crisis. And I argue that the post-colonial nature of the migrant crisis also feeds into its economic crisis, into the economic crisis of the European Union. Europe's long colonial past is essential to understanding either of these present crises and the project of unification, which should really be viewed as facets or aspects of the same historical process. Somebody pointed out to me that there's a very appropriate backdrop here of Europe's colonial past. It seems fairly self-evident that the most notorious figures of migrancy in Europe today, the most hyper-visible variants of the figure of migrant, are the terrorist and the refugee. Equally evident is the fact that both these figures have legible Islamic markings. There should be no confusion here that I am making claims about the figures that populate European social and political imaginaries, rather than about the demography of contemporary migration per se. But it must not be thought that the imaginary constructions, Hanif Qureshi was talking yesterday about the sort of phantasmic figure of the Muslim now in Europe and all the things that get projected onto it. It's that sort of thing that I'm interested in here. It must not be thought that these imaginary constructions have a merely phantasmal relationship to social reality. They must be understood as being very much elements of the social, whose logic permeates the logics of social relations and social action. So far as the figure of terrorist is concerned, in the post-9/11 era, broadly speaking, the imaginary formations I am considering here have been impacted and both transformed and reinforced repeatedly by events that involve both Islam and violence. As for the refugee, its locus classicus is Europe's southern periphery, Greece and Italy in particular, although of course it is by definition a figure of movement and dispersion, bent on undertaking, often despite insurmountable obstacles, perilous cross-continental journeys that are marked in stark contrast by an historically unprecedented ease and fluidity of motion for most Europeans. The rivers of humanity that flowed across the continent in 2015, carving one channel after another through the fissures and cracks of the Schengen regime, have put this very system for the regulation of the movement of populations in Europe into question. On the one hand, at least momentarily, for an extended moment, on the one hand, these refugees from the war zones of the Middle East and Syria in particular and beyond have in effect become rather like formerly stateless persons, a figure that is quite familiar, of course, in European history. Unable to count on any state in particular, least of all their nation-state of origin, to protect their political rights. On the other hand, their very arrival in Europe in such large numbers calls into question the ongoing post-national rearrangement of the continent, including the forms of multiculturalism that have governed integration over these last decades. Some of the traditional national antagonisms of modern European politics, France and Germany are the usually cited example, of course, may now indeed have been largely overcome due to the development of the European framework, even in the unexpected and paradoxical form of pan-European fascism. But another feature of the pre-war decades has reappeared with striking intensity. The sense shared by large numbers of people that the presence of relatively small alien, so-called alien population, constitutes a threat to the integrity not just of the individual nation states, as early in the previous century, but of the continent-wide civilization as a whole. And while the minority populations that produced such anxieties in the interwar years were disproportionately Jewish, this time around they seem to be disproportionately Muslim, which is, in the ways that it functions in contemporary Muslim life, contemporary European life. Sorry, nice Freudian slip. Yes, we're going to take over very soon. They seem to be disproportionately Muslim, which is, in the ways that it functions in contemporary European life, a relatively recent designation fabricated out of complex social, cultural, and historical geography. Whereas Jewish inmates of the camps reduced to a near-death condition were once derided by their torturers as Musulmana, these Muslims now appear to be subjected, at least in some places in Europe, to at least some of the discourses once directed at Jews, discourses concerning contagion, cliquishness, religious coteries, hidden intentions, misogyny, and sexual violence. And as we have now seen, this generalized figure of Muslim is in many ways now a global figure, as much meaningful and resonant in North America or India as in Europe itself. And so this project has really undergone big transformations for me in recent years, because the object I'm trying to describe is changing in front of our eyes. And one of the things that interests me is the way in which it has now become a kind of pan-Occidental discourse and set of questions, where American actors and agents and movements very much engaged in what was previously a kind of Europe-specific question, so that the figure of Muslim is now very resonant in the same ways, of course, in the US as it is in Europe. A sign of this complex transition might be the fact that many right-wing formations in Europe today are divided about who the real enemy is, Muslims or Jews. At its inception, the Islamophobic and neo-fascistic English Defense League, for instance, the EDL, actually had a Jewish brigade, as it was called, headed by an Israeli expatriate. But this collapsed when she left the organization for what she called its persistent anti-Semitism. The National Front in France has premised its project of de-demonization, as they call it, precisely on shedding their anti-Semitic past as an organization, and the daughter shedding the father's anti-Semitic origins. After which, a senior official has explained, all else will become possible and legitimate, an ominous reference to Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism. And I don't think we should be complacent about the election results, because really the overall trajectory is a pretty dramatic increase in the share of the vote in the presidential election, and for other kinds of reasons. Could we thus perhaps say that the minor forms of being European, and this is the subject of my earlier book called Enlightenment in the Colony, the Jewish Question and the Crisis of Post-Colonial Culture. Could we perhaps thus say that the minor forms of being European that were once uprooted, dispersed, and finally corralled into camps in preparation for their extermination, this is Hannah Arendt's famous image, seem now to have re-emerged again, these minor forms of being European, seem to have re-emerged again throughout European society. At the very least, it seems clear that once again Europe is host to a culture, that is to say, a stable habitus of people desperately on the run. And the financial crisis and Great Recession have reproduced the conditions for as in the Great Depression in the 1930s, for the active scapegoating of these migrants, refugees, and minorities. No appeal on the left to a European demos, however inclusively conceived, and that is a standard leftist progressive impulse, is to speak of a European demos that is inclusive of the so-called migrant population, second, third generation. No appeal on the left to a European demos, however inclusively conceived as the claimant to a common life on the continent, can therefore overcome or bypass this necessity of confronting the imperial origins of the European idea, it's the colonial past. In the absence of such a self-critique of the European idea, the demos is threatened with reverting to ethnos, a political progressive concept, and an ethnos on a continental scale, a political progressive concept of the European people reverting to a reactionary cultural or civilizational one. No single contemporary thinker of the European left has done more to elaborate this distinction in recent years, it seems to me, than Etienne Balibar, and his work is both a major influence on the mode of thinking that I'm trying to develop here, and also a critical interlocutor for it. The critical task, as it seems to me, is therefore to elaborate a way of thinking about some of the practices, concepts, categories, narratives, and representations that have governed European life in recent decades, which take seriously the colonial and imperial origins and nature of the practices of Europeanness itself. As should already be clear, such a way of thinking therefore has an angular and skeptical relationship to the terms in which the European project has been practiced and conceived. Sometimes even, as I've just noted, by the left, and poses a series of challenging questions about them. What are the implications of these imperial origins for the contemporary crisis? What are the parameters of inside and outside in these newly inscribed European, so-called European practices? What happens to the political and cultural logics of the nation-state in the emergence of the continent as horizon of social and political experience? Do conceptions of European citizenship of the sort offered in recent years by thinkers like Balibar and Habermas, transnational citizenship, for instance, in the case of the former, and constitutional patriotism in that of the latter, need to be revisited and re-examined in light of the present crisis and the palpable collapse of intercontinental solidarity along north-south lines? Do contemporary anxieties concerning alien populations and the rise of neo-fascist movements across the continent shed new light on our understanding of the Holocaust as a chronological marker in 20th century European history? How accurate a description of the present exactly is the narrative of multiculturalism in crisis? In what sense exactly is the phantom figure of Muslim in contemporary Europe a post-colonial figure? How are we to conceive of the relationship between post-colonial migrancy and the historical forms of colonialism? What has it meant historically for a society to become European? In order to answer such questions, we might begin by noting that, to a certain extent, the emergence of Europe as political horizon has in fact meant the projection of many of the logics of the nation-state, such as the requirement of cultural uniformity and notions of autochthonous development, onto the continent as a whole. Repeated warnings by two generations at least of political thinkers of divergent orientations, such as Habermas, Balibar, and Sandro Mezzadra, and many others, of course, about the consequences of such a process, have not been able to arrest it significantly. The survival and return with a vengeance in contemporary Europe of the logics of exclusion and xenophobia associated with the crisis of the nation-state that was supposed to have been overcome through economic and political union is therefore hardly a surprising development, and should have been anticipated by anyone who has not swallowed whole the self-representations of the European project by its ruling political and bureaucratic elites. And where fascisms in Europe once had anti-Semitism as their primary ideological component, the new fascism takes Islamophobia as its main content, directed at a large subset of the continent's minorities with origins in the post-colonial world. The migrant is, of course, a figure of translation in the etymological sense of the word, of carrying over, of transportation. Perhaps the quintessential sociological figure of translation in our time. A number of the papers, projects discussed yesterday, of course, dealt with this question through the question of literary composition and translation and its relationship to migrants. But what exactly does the migrant carry over? What I'm attempting to suggest here is that the migrant brings the colonial past of the continent into the problematic of its post-colonial present. Colonial racism as a social, political, and cultural logic, which was directed outward from European society, has now been redirected inward in many ways, toward a segment of the national and continental body politic itself. But the historical process is in fact an even more complex one. As earlier thinkers, so widely different from one another as Arendt and Aimé Césaire argued a long time ago, the practices of organized anti-Semitism from the late 19th century onward were the application to an internal population of methods that have been applied to native populations overseas for centuries, in some cases. With this more recent turn, then, the internally directed racisms seem to have partially erased its anti-Jewish markings and reveal more fully its colonial origins. The native now is an indigène de la République, a colonial subject internal to the republican zone of citizenship, to borrow the brilliant self-designation of a group of immigrant intellectuals and activists in France, now formed as a political party as such, called Les Indigènes de la République. To put it somewhat differently, we might say that if the form of the new racism within Europe is derived from the history of the Jewish question, its content has origins in the practices of management of colonial populations, who were rendered barbarian precisely through the instrumental deployment of Western culture and humanism, as is well known. This new articulation, however, of forms and contents, the new articulation, however, inevitably means that both form and content and their mutual interrelations have been transformed dramatically from their historical antecedents. Whereas once Jews, in the form both of their particularity as of their vaunted cosmopolitanism, were viewed as posing a danger to an emergent Europe of nations, it is now the Muslim post-colonial migrant, not only, but disproportionately so, it seems to me, who was viewed as a threat to the nation state as well as to the transnational European order, precisely by the ascription to it, among other things, of a threat to Jewish Europeans. The question of Jewish life in Europe, which once embodied the quintessential minor forms of being European, had supposedly been resolved once and for all through the establishment of Israel and the new post-war and especially post-1960s democratic political culture of most of Europe, is once again, in fact, deeply mired in majority-minority relations throughout the continent, above all, perhaps, in France. In other words, we once again have something like Jewish question in Europe, it seems to me, but in this transformed form. The state's modes of differentiation, the French state in particular, the state's modes of differentiation between Muslims and Jews also, in fact, have colonial origins. For now, we need just stress once again that post-Enlightenment Europe's crisis of minority, as I've called it elsewhere in that book, Enlightenment in the Colony, at whose core were the continent's Jewish populations and cultures, has reappeared now, the crisis of minority, has reappeared now around the post-colonial migrant sector of European societies. Such political logics seem to operate now at both the national and supranational levels. From inside, Europe might still look, the project that is, might still look like a cosmopolitan attempt in the great Kantian tradition, like a cosmopolitan attempt to overcome the xenophobias and conflicts of nationalism in a more or less democratic manner, even if that democratic dispensation is viewed as threatened by bureaucracy, or as Habermas puts it, post-democratic executive federalism. Even a range of discourses on the left reinforce such a view of unification as a progressive and a cosmopolitan reality, which remains an object of progressive political desire for precisely this reason. But from outside, the predominantly visible aspect has always been that of Fortress Europe, a continuation by other means of the range of practices for distinguishing Europe from its various others worldwide during the colonial era. Thus, in the midst of this historical process, for a society located on the continent to be declared to be European once and for all has in effect meant becoming aligned with Europe's imperial past, and in fact the retroactive adoption of the position of former imperial metropole, irrespective of its own historical past. And in recent decades, no event in the history of a society has brought the authentication of its Europeanness as unequivocally as entry into the European Union and more specifically the Eurozone. The integration of Eastern, and I think this has had a great deal to do with the Greek even the left's resistance with the idea of exiting the Eurozone in order to save the economy, and preferring going through the hell that they're going through, seemingly open-ended, because it meant to some degree a kind of loss of Europeanness. I've been working a lot on Greece and the Greek sort of question and the migrant question in Greece, and of course during the refugee crisis as well. That's one of the countries that sort of is at the center of this project, aside from Britain and France and to some extent Germany. The integration of Eastern European and Warsaw Pact societies and of Greece at an earlier phase provides material of great interest in this regard. In other words, I'm really trying to understand in parts of this project what it means to become European for a society on the continent. The kind of validation of Europeanness that takes place with joining with the European Union, integration, and all of that process of becoming European. Furthermore, the experience of Greece during its financial crisis makes it especially clear that the declaration of a society's Europeanness is a matter that can be determined elsewhere rather than internally, and that in fact it is in the nature of an offer that can be forfeited or withdrawn. This asymmetry is in fact one of the many modes of the constitution of center and periphery within the European Union itself. The history of immigration into the European countries since the early post-war years makes this structure eminently visible. In France and Britain, the pattern of post-colonial migration was set in the 1950s and 1960s, before the emergence of the European Union, properly speaking. This process reinscribed the imperial metropole-colonial periphery relationship in and for the post-colonial era. The needs of industry for plentiful, cheap labor during the post-war reconstruction led, as it were, naturally to the importing of migrants from the former and in some cases current imperial peripheries. To state the obvious, it is not an accident that these immigrant populations were from the former colonies, North and West Africa and France, South Asia and West Indies in the UK. The so-called immigrant problem in these countries now relates mostly to, or at the very least also encompasses, second and third generation descendants of these early immigrants. The notorious views of Alain Finkielkraut, a son of post-war Jewish emigres from Poland, who has emerged as the leading reactionary neo-nationalist intellectual in France, the most vocal critic of the Arab and Muslim populations of the banlieue, and champion of La France Gauloise, are of special interest to us in this regard. For media intellectuals like Finkielkraut, it is clear that the French state has failed in its mission civilisatrice twice over, once in the colonies and the second time in the suburbs of its own cities. Like their ancestors in colonial times and places, these young men and women of North African descent and Muslim belief or cultural affiliation cannot be considered French because they are bearers of values, as he puts it, that are fundamentally primitive and other to the national and European traditions of France. This Europe-France is a space that Jews, including those of North African Arab origin, can, like Derrida, can and have entered, but not Arab Muslims or Muslims in general. The dominant contemporary modes of differentiating between Jews and Muslims therefore simply represent a continuation of practices of the colonial era, dating at least as far back as the early 1840s, when Ashkenazi French rabbis were brought in to head all the native Jewish congregations as part of the process of the Europeanization of Algeria's Arab Jews, practices that culminated in the Crimea Decree of 1870, granting citizenship to Algerian Jews and to Jews alone. It is possible that and of course quite a bit of Derrida's late work is about the sort of ambiguous and ambivalent status as citizen for the Algerian Jewish population. Under Vichy, of course, the citizenship was cancelled, was abrogated. It is possible that in the emergence of right-wing and Islamophobic phenomena across the continent, at least since Anders Breivik's manifesto, the Norwegian mass murderer, who, I don't know if people are familiar with this, I mean, he's a very interesting figure, really, because the amount of material he has given us. The day that he did his killing, he released online a 1,500-page manifesto. And part of what one of the crazier things I've done is to kind of do a close reading of parts of this manifesto. It's a very interesting document. It mentions Gayatri Spivak, by the way, of all things. At least since Breivik's manifesto, we are witnessing the emergence of a European patriotism as such, just not in the form once imagined by Habermas. And a formation like Pegida has, of course, made this fact explicit in its very name as patriotic Europeans, not Germans. Breivik's compendium is a revealing document of the present crisis, marking as it does the emergence of a fascism that is continental in its imaginations and determinations, in which nationally localized right-wing radical movements see themselves as part of a larger continent-wide ensemble. Whether the affective orientations of this ensemble can survive the expanding north-south fissure in Europe remains very much to be seen. Because, of course, Golden Dawn and Greece, and the tensions between that formation and Northern European right-wing movements, for instance. At the same time, however, Breivik's manifesto seems to offer English as the lingua franca of this encompassing European fascism, an innovation in the history of fascisms in Europe that itself merits closer examination. And Breivik invokes a standard figure of the contemporary right-wing imagination in Europe and the US, effeminized left, either female or effeminized male left intellectuals as the agents of the decline of Western civilization, a theme utilized effectively by Michel Houellebecq in his extraordinary novel Soumission, Submission, published in 2015, released by some bizarre coincidence on the same day as the attacks on the offices of Charlie Hebdo. And this is, by the way, now also a staple, the effeminized left intellectual, also a staple of the discourse of the far right in the United States. I wish to suggest here that these contemporary conditions call for an updating of Hannah Arendt's notion of the pariah in European society. Unlike the earlier historical situation referenced in Arendt's concept, namely the post-Enlightenment reinscription of Jews in Europe as an alien Asiatic population, these new pariahs are produced primarily, though not exclusively, from immigrant populations originating in the former zones of imperial influence of the various European powers. The concept of pariah must therefore be refashioned in interaction with the concept of colonial society and made adequate to the contemporary social and cultural geography of minority experience. Reconfigured in this way, the pariah may be as much a figure of continuity as discontinuity in European history across the radical rupture that we usually take the Holocaust to be. At one level, of course, the history of majority-minority relations in European society in the 20th century is a patently discontinuous one, with the war and the genocide marking that moment of fissure. But the concept of the new pariah offers us a way of looking across this rupture at the manner in which the symbolic and structural place of the exterminated Jewish minorities has now been filled by populations displaced from the post-colonial world. Arendt derived the concept of pariah from the fin de siècle polemics of Bernard Lazare, who was one of the leading French participants in the Dreyfus affair, but it is also a reference, of course, to Max Weber's characterization of the historical status of Jews in traditional European societies as outcasts. On the one hand, Arendt lauds Lazare's tragically failed attempt to translate the pariah in political terms into the rebel, the conscious pariah, as he calls it, opposed to the very social system that produced and reproduced its pariah status. Lazare had found himself opposed to the position of the Jewish parvenu, as Arendt calls it, who played patron to the Jewish pariah. This is the sort of way in which he's thinking of class distinction and inequality within the Jewish community in Western European societies. Dissipating the possibility of political action on the part of the populace, the Jewish populace, for their rights, against their common enemies in the patron-client relations that were part of the very social system that constituted the Jewish pariah. On the other hand, she saw in the continent full of displaced persons during the war, in the very midst of war and genocide, the very possibility of a different basis for the reconstitution of European society. In a letter from 1950, for instance, extracts from which have now been published as The Minority Question, an extraordinary text that was not known to me when I wrote Enlightenment in the Colony. It's really quite an extraordinary text. The Minority Question, she notes, I quote, "Although they are Europeans, these pariahs are isolated from all specifically national interests. They are the first to have an interest in pan-European politics. And despite their various origins, such politics do bind or could bind them together, pan-European politics. But such politics can provide them no way of losing their original nationalities, even though that loss is their only chance. If everything were to play out very well, they might be the forerunners of a new Europe." It's an extraordinary statement, really, to think of the inmates of the concentration camps and the DP camps and people on the run and as the possible forerunners of a new European possibility. The implications of the statement for the, unquote, the implications of the statement for the current European crisis are significant. It seems to me that what Arendt is pointing to here, in this positing of the stateless person as the paradigm for a future post-genocide European, is the road that was ultimately not taken in the post-war decades. Arendt posits exile and statelessness against cosmopolitanism as the political and social experience most capable of producing a new European subjectivity that can overcome not only the traditional national antagonisms of continental Europe, but also its repeated fabrication of pariah peoples, either from within European societies themselves, as in the early 20th century, or from the former zones of imperial influence, as in the post-war decades. This was sort of the impulse of my question to Sam Weber yesterday, a bit unfair because I just kind of pulled it out of nowhere. With few exceptions, contemporary European political thought does not appear to me to have taken the leap necessary, the leap that Arendt has taken in that passage and is calling for, the leap necessary to place contemporary forms of pariah experience at the center of its consideration of European politics, as, to recall Arendt's phrase from another era, the most symptomatic aspect of the European crisis. You know, she speaks of the stateless in the 40s as the most symptomatic figure of European politics. Not the citizen, but the stateless as the most symptomatic figure of European politics. The new pariahs constituted through the forms of racialization of social and cultural difference that are historically derived from the colonial era. As Sandro Mezzadra noted a few years ago, I quote, "The whiteness of the European citizen has not been put into question by multiculturalism. It has only been rhetorically weakened," he says, "in order to make its coexistence with non-white citizens possible, while this coexistence has always been imagined and constituted, especially by the immigration policies, as a hierarchical existence," unquote. The constellation surrounding the refugee can with ease expand its reach to bring even second and third generation migrants into its purview. In contemporary European culture, long settled legal immigrants and even second and third generation Europeans can come to be marked as indistinguishable from the refugees and sans-papiers that exist at the fringes of the migrant experience. The failed immigrant always calls the legitimacy of the immigrant experience as such into question. Statelessness is thus a limit condition which a wide range of divergent experience of displacement seem to tend toward and to approximate. I think I'll stop there. I could go on a bit longer, but as you say, I'm out of time now. So I'm sorry. I'm sure there are many holes in this. It's sections taken from different sort of parts of the project. Be happy to try and fill in any gaps that we find. Thank you.
Thank you very much.